What I'm going to do here is just talk about what should be in a rock art site management plan. And you may need to actually see where the little pictures are on the right or above or below. Choose the thing, the bar that has the different little squares. If you choose the one with the one little square, that'll knock it down so that we're not in the way of the PowerPoint. And then you can move that down to the bottom so it's out of your way. Okay, so a good management plan will basically do 4 things. It will help protect the sites from damage. It will respect the various stakeholders. It will accommodate research and public interest, and it will be adaptable to change. So in other words, you can make it better as you learn more. So the first thing that you want to look at when you're developing a management plan is, why is the plan needed? What's the purpose of it? Are you planning to develop the site for visitors? Is it a reaction to damage to the site? Maybe it's a private owner who just wants to know the best things to do to protect the site. So this is the first thing you're going to look at. Why is the plan needed? What are its parameters? What's going to be covered by the plan and what isn't? And obviously, for most plans, the more parameters, the better, because you want it to be adaptable to any thing that might come up. Who is in charge of preparing the plan and who is in charge of approving it, and how long will it be in effect? So if you're talking about a federal or provincial agency or state agency, you want to know, is this plan binding? And on whom is it binding and for how long? And if there's an existing management plan, for example, maybe you've got a management plan for the entire forest or national park, how does this specific rock art site management plan fit in with the larger management plan? Okay, so the second thing you're going to look at, try to identify, is who are the interested or invested parties. And this is generally going to fall into these categories: Indigenous communities who have a link to the place, either historically or geographically; local people who have a link to the place because they live there or because they have an interest in the history of the area; landowners and leaseholders. So a lot of times on Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, that land is leased for other purposes such as grazing or mineral exploration. Agency personnel, and of course, that's who's ever in charge of managing the larger public land on which the rock art is found. Researchers and educators, and then finally tourists, hikers, and rock art enthusiasts. So you're going to have to take all these people into account if you have identified them as an interested or invested party. Okay, so what needs to be evaluated? Who owns the site? Who owns the access to the site? That's also important. Who is the responsible agency if the site is on public land? This seems pretty straightforward, but sometimes it gets a little complicated. The physical setting, and that means things like the geology, the rock base; the geomorphology, which is basically the landscape and the history of how that landscape has changed; the drainage pattern; and then foot and vehicle traffic, how accessible is the site, and what are you going to do about that accessibility one way or the other. Associated archaeological remains. So for example, in the Southwest, a lot of rock art sites are near village sites, and you need to take that into account. If there's buried deposits or likely to be buried deposits underneath a rock art panel, you want to protect those buried deposits so they don't get damaged when you are putting in walkways or otherwise changing the site. And other rock art, because you may not yet have discovered all the rock art at the site. So you need to assess whether there's likely to be more rock art there and what to do about that. And then the site's relationship with other cultural resources. So there may be a traditional cultural property nearby. There may be, you know, I'm thinking of a place like Mesa Verde where there's lots and lots of archaeological ruins in association with the rock art. And of course, your management plan needs to address that. Current and proposed uses. If you're in a national park, the current and proposed use is for people to come and enjoy the national park. But if you're on Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management, you have multiple use management. So there's going to be other things like mining and grazing and tourism and logging that all have to be taken into account. You want to evaluate the causes of any existing damage to a site. These can be natural things like erosion or mass wasting, which is when the rock or the hillside falls down. Damage from vandalism. Dave, I'm getting an echo. Can you fix that?
I think, there we go.
Okay. Vandalism obviously is the one everybody talks about. And then just overuse, which is kind of loving the site to death. Too many people go there and it begins to have an impact just from the number of people. And of course, the classic example of that are some of the Paleolithic caves in France, where just the fact that people were going in there and breathing was changing the chemistry of the air around the sites, and it was impacting the paintings inside the caves. Changes to the natural setting. So this is things like structures, roads. This is what you archaeologists are always dealing with your view shed. What is going on? What has been changed in the natural setting so that it's not really what it looked like when the rock art was made or used in the past. You want to look at previous research and publications. What kind of research has been done? Is it valuable to your efforts or not? And what would you need to do to allow future research? And then finally, the status and quality of site records. So a lot of sites are only partially recorded. Some people have gone in and photographed or otherwise recorded the petroglyphs, but not the graffiti. And this is a problem because if you're managing the site, you need to have a record. If something changes, you need to be able to document that change very specifically. So that takes care of the first part of the evaluation that's going to be in your management plan. Then you need to identify any potential threats to the site's integrity. So physical and environmental threats. These are things like direct sunlight, which may fade pigments, vegetation encroachment. And that's a tricky one because sometimes you want the vegetation there to kind of put a barrier between visitor and the rock art. Sometimes you don't want it there because it's actually presenting a hazard in that the vegetation is rubbing up against the rock, or maybe if there's a wildfire, that particular tree or trees are liable to fall onto the rock art and damage it. So these are things you need to evaluate. Water, is water draining over the edge of the cliff or down behind, at the back of a rock shelter? This can do quite a bit of damage to rock art. Animals. Yes, I have written a site evaluation that talked about cows pooping right onto the rock art. So you need to look at both wild animals and domesticated animals, and if you need to be keeping them away from the site somehow. The exposure of the rock, is it buried is the rock art partially buried? Is it becoming unburied, which is yet another challenge? And then things like lichen and moss that may grow on top of rock art and threaten its physical integrity. Increased traffic. Vandalism, I don't think we need to go into. I think that's pretty straightforward, but increased traffic leading to vandalism, unauthorized digging, or artifact collecting. These are all things that you want to evaluate the potential for. Unintentional damage from overuse. So this is can be something just as simple as trampling the deposits below a rock art site, people touching the rock art and leaving their skin oils on the rock, which certainly changes the chemistry of the rock. People may be trying to remove vegetation so that they can get a picture. So these type of things you want to try to evaluate as best that you can. Pollution from things like acid rain, dust, and you also, if the sediment below the rock art is containing toxic materials, you're going to want to talk about that, because you'll have to address that both in your visitor planning, but also in protecting the physical integrity of the rock art. Water and dust, we kind of talked about. Natural and human-made disasters. So wildfire, flooding, drought, which might remove the vegetation that's between the people and the rock art, can be a factor. Hurricanes, lava flows. Yes, in Hawaii, lava covers up rock art from time to time. I don't think there's too much you can do about it. Wind, especially in the west where we have these sandstone cliffs, the wind will actually pick up that sand and just sandblast the rock art panels. And if you're near a coast, of course, rising sea levels from climate change is an increasing issue. And then animals, the effect of domesticated animals like cattle and horses can do quite a bit of damage if they're allowed near the rock art panels. Cliff swallows, raptors, eagles, and hawks like to build their nests up in those cliffs, and then they are excreting guano down the face of the rock. Bats, the same deal. And wasps, which the bug experts tell me do not exist. In fact, they do burrow into the rocks in the western sandstones. So these are all things you need to look for and address in your management plan. Okay, so then you want to look and see what resources you have available to you. Funding, people, in other words, some of the experts like you met this morning. Legal and law enforcement controls, whether you're on public land or private land, it's going to be a little bit different laws in effect, but Obviously, these sites on public lands are protected by antiquities legislation. So you can certainly call on that if you need to. Local communities involvement, indigenous communities involvement. Sometimes you can do a co-management arrangement with local or indigenous communities, and sometimes that can work out really very, very well. And then you want to look at curation, and Tim Urbaniak mentioned that this morning, that you can't just collect the data. You need to have a place to put it, and it has to be updated regularly so that you don't lose access to your digital resources, because they become extinct very quickly, as we all know. So before you start recommending any particular actions, you need to make sure a few of these things. First, do no harm. And this, of course, is what Claire was talking about. Don't do anything to the site unless you're sure that you're not making the situation worse unintentionally. So we want to avoid damage from well-meaning efforts at recording, cleanup, or restoration. And there's, with the type of recording digital things that we have available now, there's really no reason ever to touch the rock. And so if your recording effort involves putting something over the rock, you really don't need to do that anymore. We can get the same or better results using some of these digital recording techniques. Make sure your efforts are sustainable and reversible. And what that means is, if you're putting in, for example, a walkway, you want to not damage any rock art in putting it in. And you also want to be able to remove it or to change it. And one of the things that happened in Australia, they were using recycled plastic for the walkways. And then they had these terrible wildfires a few years ago. That rock art, that plastic walkways melted and made a toxic gas that had a very bad impact on the rock art. Well, nobody had anticipated that, but of course now they're replacing them with more inert walkway materials. So you do need to kind of look at the details on that and make sure your efforts are reversible and sustainable as far as you can make them. Listen to indigenous communities, descendant communities. It is, as some of the speakers have already mentioned, this rock art essentially belongs to them, and we definitely want to respect their voices. And this will allow you actually to do better interpretive materials if you're doing interpretive materials, and it will allow you to avoid a lot of mistakes along the way. Listen to one of the things that I learned about these voices was that some Native American communities, First Nations communities, do not want kind of heroic measures. They want the rock art to fade over time. That's what it's meant to do. So this is an issue that you would need to take their voice into account, and how can we best come up with a plan that allows that. I don't know why my sentence disappeared there. It's kind of sad, but what it said was, listen to the voices of the descendants of those who made or used the rock art, and those who may still be using it in traditional manners. Ensure your effort has enough funding and direction. So we all have great ideas, but they don't amount to much unless we can actually put them into effect. Seek input from local communities. Is this going to affect the local community? And If so, how? So that you're not getting crosswise with the people that your actions are going to impact. And then finally, you want to come up with a set of actions, recommendations around all of these things: site recording, stewardship programs. A stewardship program is when you train people to go out and check on the sites from time to time and to document any changes that they observe. Preventing damage. Now there's all kinds of different things available. Cameras, fences, as Yanni Laubser mentioned, rerouting trails and roads so that it's back away from the rock art panels. Having guides there to bring people to and from the rock art site. Things like dust control. If there's a road near the site or a quarry near the site, you may need to address the problem of dust. Water diversion. If water is damaging the site, you might be able to do a simple diversion to mitigate that damage. Structures, I just mentioned about the walkways. Site maintenance, just keeping the site clean and accessible and so forth. You may decide to limit public access to the site. You'll have to figure out how to do that. Or you might want to limit the visibility of panels that are endangered. So for example, I know one time I recommended that a municipal park just pile some rocks up, not against the rock art panel, but just in front of it to make it less visible because it was attracting graffiti. Keeping visitors away from rock surfaces. So those are all ways of preventing damage. Responding to damage. How do you report damage? Who's in charge of taking that report? Who's in charge of investigating it? How do you collect evidence, etc., that type of thing. On public land, you're going to have to treat this type of damage as a crime scene. You're going to be working with your law enforcement people. And so it's very valuable to have a good relationship with them and to just understand how to document the damage and not mess up any evidence that that might be still present at the site. And these days we've got people with cell phones videotaping the people damaging the rock art, which kind of puts a whole new light on it. We'll see how that turns out in the long run. Mitigating damage, and we had some talk about that, about camouflaging or removing graffiti. As you probably have figured out, it's a pretty dicey subject, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the breakout sessions this afternoon. It can be tricky, as a couple of the speakers mentioned, to decide what's graffiti versus what is historically valuable. The federal agencies use that 50-year limit, but you know it's a moving target. So I think it is important to kind of discuss this in the management plan, how you're going to make that decision, and maybe you just leave everything there. Let's see what else. You may need to reroute traffic. We talked about that. You may need to modify the water drainage. We talked about that. Okay, are you going to develop the site for visitation, or are you going to try to keep people out? And that's a pretty basic decision. You may want to develop part of it and keep people away from the rest of it. If you do develop it for tourism, you have all kinds of things you need to address. Safety measures, accessibility, how to protect the site from the impact of people visiting. Are you going to install interpretive signs? If so, who decides what's on the signs? Are you going to have guides? How are you going to control the traffic? How are you going to limit the numbers if you need to limit the numbers? And also, you're probably going to want to consider things like, do you want to replicate a site visit? And you can easily do this through videos in a visitor's center so that it gives people the chance to see the rock art without actually going to the site. So these are all things to think about if you are going to develop for tourism. And if you're not, you need to figure out how you're going to keep people from going in or limit the traffic. We talked about including local and indigenous voices. I'm going to keep emphasizing that. You're going to want to keep a record of everything you did, and you're going to want to have a set of policies so that when something comes up, you can turn to the management plan. For example, I've written management plans in which there was a contingency for wildfire, and the federal agency was able to actually use those recommendations and protect the rock art so that it didn't get heavily damaged by the fire. You know, you have to assume that's going to happen sooner or later, so you want to account for that. How can you raise public and political awareness of the value of rock art? And this, of course, is important because, first of all, you're spending public money, usually, and you're going to be basing this on historic preservation law. So we want to make sure that we have good laws in place. And so you do have a bit of a responsibility to promote appreciation of the rock art. Let's see, site monitoring and record upkeep. I think we talked about that, and the sustainability. We have also talked about that. Okay, so then you need to figure out how your plan will be implemented and how you will evaluate and improve it. So you want to schedule regular evaluations. Is it working? Is it not? For example, in Yanni Laubser's presentation, he showed what happened with the graffiti at the site in Texas after it became a state park. So that type of information is really helpful and will let you use your resource effectively. Have your protective actions worked, or is the site still getting damaged at the same rate that it was before? Have you addressed Indigenous concerns? Have you incorporated Indigenous knowledge in the interpretive materials? In other words, did you listen to the related Indigenous communities? Are the interpretive materials well received? Has anybody objected to anything in the interpretive materials? And if so, how did you address that? And this is always a dicey topic. Many First Nations, Native American people would prefer that there not be any interpretive material because they have seen so much bad interpretation, and they feel like it's confusing to their young people and so forth. So this is something that I think needs constant revision and improvement. And if you've had to call in law enforcement, what has been the result? What were you able to secure the crime scene, such as it were, and actually get a conviction or an out-of-court settlement? Okay, has visitation increased? What has been the impact? If you're on public land, was the plan implemented as you thought it would be? Have any new threats arisen? And if so, how have they been addressed? So maybe there's been a housing development put in next to the site. So there's more people there. Maybe there's some mining going on or so forth. So you want to constantly be evaluating if things are changing and what you might need to do to address those changes. What has been the result of stewardship or partnership programs? Have newly discovered sites or panels been thoroughly recorded and reported? And again, this goes back to having enough money, or maybe developing a volunteer team to do some of that work. And what has been the result of restricting access to the site? Did it work? Didn't it work? This is something that you need to constantly be looking at so that you're not making things worse. So again, the whole goal is to respect, protect, teach, study, and enjoy rock art or rock imagery. And I'm not meaning to be disrespectful by using the term rock art, but it's the term that more people are familiar with. So we'll gradually make that transition to rock imagery. Here are some resources for you. The first one is the ARARA, American Rock Art Research Association website. There are many resources there. If you go to YouTube and search ARARA Rock Art, you will come to our YouTube channel, which has lectures and all kinds of other interesting things on it. If you go to the Getty Conservation Institute, www.getty.edu, they have these 3 publications about rock art site management. There's a lot of good information in these books, in particular the first one. So check it out. It's free to download, and it'll give you a lot of good ideas about site management.